Thank you. I'm a volunteer here at the Mayor's Museum, been on the Speakers Bureau, and I've been a volunteer for, 30 years. A short remark in advance. I'm very aware that for Native Americans, Columbus and the commemoration of him is somewhat controversial, and that Columbus is symbolic of much grief that they've had experienced. And in this presentation, I'm leaving this question aside for now. Some of you may have seen my presentations before. Therefore, I offer right now an apology and disappointment. Remember when you answered a question, you got something? See, you didn't get it. I can throw chocolate all day. I'm sorry, I can't get it to you. Nonetheless, let's go with it. I love dramatic titles. Against all odds, compulsion to sail west. We're talking about an era, not necessarily about one man, but here we are, comfortably encrusted as we have been since March. We're in our comfy homes, we have our houses and our mortgages, we pay our taxes, and we've established our schools and our churches and such. So we're settled in a land that a little over 500 years ago did not even exist to most of the world. Why are we here? That's not an existential question today. It's a geographical question. Why are we here in America? Why is the nation here? Luck of the draw. Did you have a vote as to where you were born? Probably not. Where you would set down roots. Serendipity. A fortunate accident. Why were sailors so obsessed with sailing west that they did so at the cost of their very lives? 500 years ago, the Great Wall of China was built. This is not it. America's 500 years old. That's not old. This is Hadrian's Wall. We have to add a couple thousand to that. Well, many of these sailors went to sea to look for a path west, and they died. Why'd they do that? There are a lot of reasons, but the greatest, probably most compelling of these is trade, and trade equals wealth. Control the trade routes, and you control the wealth. Control the wealth of the world, and you control the world itself. I didn't say that, Sir Walter Raleigh did. In the 15th and 16th centuries, as global explosion was launching the Western European expansion throughout the world, the invisible barriers and frontiers finally fell away in Spain and Portugal, pioneers in the exploration with their fine fleets of ships called caravels, were voyaging farther and farther down the west coast of Africa in search of what? In search of anything and everything. They, especially the unwashed masses, sought to gain everything through conquest, through empire building, but the best way to get everything was and is to control trade. Well, the past 700 years of their existence, trade was dominated by the Arab caravans. Their dominance was secured by limiting access to trade goods. That seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? They dealt only with the great trading centers in Venice, in Genoa. So they were essentially exercising price control. Now stir in the elements of politics, of geography, of religion, of greed. And now you have the cost of goods rising and rising. And that's what happens. Simultaneously, a reawakening of the arts, of science, of geography, a care for mathematics, an understanding of navigation. All of these things were flowering in the Western world. The people of Western Europe began thinking for themselves after a long age of darkness. The sea would be their interstate as they moved toward a solution to the fetters of trade that the Eastern Empire had imposed upon them. If the world is a sphere, as most understood at that time, then the riches, the spices, the precious metals and such that lay to the east also lay to the west along the same latitude. Men tried the west. and they were lost and largely forgotten. But the way west was not abandoned. Our main focus today will be a highly regarded sailor, an explorer, a navigator whose 55 years on this earth linked the 2 centuries of the great age of exploration, the 15th and the 16th century. Among the most significant discoveries in the history of man was one that occurred smack in the middle of this era. The year 1492 was a momentous one for Spain. Early in the year, on January the 2nd, in fact, the city of Granada, the last great Moorish stronghold in Europe, surrendered to Christian armies after over 700 years of a rather fitful coexistence and 7 years of on and off military campaigns. The Catholic sovereigns, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, had married and combined their kingdoms of Castile and Aragon against the Muslim Emirate, successfully ending the last Islamic rule on the Iberian Peninsula. The victorious monarchs rode in triumph through the streets. No ticker tape parades for them. No, that was ecologically unsound. In that same year, a great scholar, Elio Antonio de Nebrija, published the first grammar of a modern language and presented a copy to the Queen in dedication. When she asked as to what purpose the book might serve, a courtier responded, "Your Royal Majesty, language has always been the companion of empire." It's a pretty heavy-duty statement. Nebrija's words were prophetic. That empire would, for a moment in history, bring glory and riches to the crown of Castile, the kingdom of Spain today. The same year, on Christmas Day, an explorer for Spain planted the royal flag on an island in a land previously unknown to Europe and opened an era of maritime dominance for Spain that would catapult her to the head of an expanding empire never before known in the Western world. Cristoforo Colombo, his name in Ligurian. We're going to call him Cristoforo Columbus. It's a lot easier to remember. Probably born in September or October of 1451. The son of a weaver, his father Domenico worked in the wool trade. There exists today a rather large body of work, none contemporary with the Columbus family, that propose that Domenico and Christopher himself were Knights Templar. With many an epic tale of those giants of history, proof of these statements is sorely lacking. His mother, Susanna Fontanarossa, was a homemaker who had 2 sons, Chris, of course, and his brother, Bartholomew. There may have been 2 other brothers by Susanna or a later wife, but again, as with so much of history, we didn't know this information may in just a few centuries be awfully important, so we didn't keep too much track of it. This was just a family of sheep herders and wool workers in Genoa. So the supposed brothers, however, do show up later in the annals of at least one historian, and possibly more, who has them in rather negative and inconvenient circumstances with their older brother Christopher, and names them Giovanni and Giacomo. They weren't that important, so we don't have any statues or paintings. So they were probably real, but not necessarily the sons of Christopher's mother, Susanna. Christopher grew up in Genoa, probably helping his father in the wool business. He was illiterate up to the age of 25, as were most in his time. But he began then to educate himself. He set about learning to read, to speak, and to write in 3 languages: Portuguese, language of navigation; Castilian, the upper class language of Spain and Portugal; and Latin, the language of learning, of scholarship, and of culture. He also dabbled in the Greek language to some extent. He had a thought that these language skills may serve him well in the future. He was probably correct in this, and in fact, to make sure that his personal journals of exploration were safe from prying eyes, he kept his journals in Latin for the most part, and another secret journal in Greek. Not very many people read Greek at the time. He came to master Latin and used Greek comfortably, as he was a quick study and quite committed to expanding his knowledge. His zeal, his ambition, his opportunism, and perseverance were certainly helpful in this and all of his pursuits. These characteristics were, in fact, the engine of his success in moving from the lower middle classes of merchants and laborers into which he was born up to another world where he could marry well, converse with royalty of the church and state, and seek national backing for his chaotic and presumptuous dream, a dream that he envisioned as singularly important and unique. He went to sea at an early age, maybe 10, more likely 14 or 15. He sailed with a noted Genoese family named De Negri. He had begun an apprenticeship as a business agent for the De Negri and the Spinola families, both well-known, very highly respected. But he couldn't decline an offer to join the ship's crews on several trade voyages. Well, he proved himself a thoroughly competent seaman and navigator and rose from deckhand to captain in a very short while. It's not what you know, it's who you know. He also began to transmute into an almost legendary figure with tales of his dramatic exploits. An apocryphal story has him shipwrecked off Portugal. In fact, near Sagres, where Henry the Navigator had his famous, called it a school for navigation. He goes on to tell of Columbus swimming across 6 miles of open water with only an oar for a flotation device to reach Portugal, where he joined his younger brother in Lisbon. Bartholomew was working as a cartographer, a map maker at the time. Think about the absurdity of the tale. Possible? I suppose so, swimming 6 miles in open waters, finding his brother in Lisbon, Portugal. Probable? Well, it sort of tests the breadth of one's belief. In 1479, Christopher married Dona Filipa Perestrello y Moniz. She was the daughter of the governor of Porto Santo. She was a widow from this very wealthy and prominent Portuguese family. Well, Columbus and his new wife lived on the Madeira Islands. That's the Madeira Islands in the 15th century, and there it is. That's where they live. That's their dining room. You can find their car in there somewhere if you look hard enough. Columbus and his new wife lived on that island and had one son. That was Diego. Dona Filipa died shortly after Diego's birth, just a very few years. Diego spent the greatest part of his life in legal battles, attempting to secure the claims of his father, and he died in 1526. Everyone you encounter plays a role in your life, some important, some minor. Dona Filipa's role was certainly an important one, if only for the fact that she was the wife of the man who became the Cristoforo Columbus. But in addition, she brought him added stature and importance because of her family connections in the courts and in society, and of course bore him a son who would travel with him on many of his ocean voyages. Filipa's father was also a noted ship's captain who had an impressive collection of maps and charts. A chart inventory was a necessity in those times, and the captain, the navigator, the ship's master, who had an extensive collection, was considered a very fortunate person and held in high esteem. Columbus acquired all of these maps and charts at her father's death, and in fact used them to build a huge library of charts and maps, which of course he passed on to his son. Well, all of this is setting the stage for what became arguably the most important voyage of exploration and discovery that the world has ever witnessed. Unfortunately, however, the details are sketchy and somewhat confused. What we have as records were written under differing circumstances and by differing authors. Some, of course, by Columbus himself, some by those who denied his claims, and some by those who sided with him. I really feel that details are, in this sense, less important than results. So we can discuss, we can argue, we can parse any of the supposed facts of Columbus's earlier life. That's an exercise in debate with very little historic value. The real fact of the voyages remains, and herein lies the compelling theme of our story. Columbus's idea began to take form after his wife Filipa's death. He settled with his son Diego in Lisbon, Portugal. Portugal was a powerful nation that had, in their national conscience, explored all there was to explore. What better environment could he have chosen? His research begins with maps and with charts. Ptolemy, that famous first century mathematician, astronomer, geographer, had mapped the known world in about 150 AD. His measurements, his assumptions, however, were inaccurate, to put it mildly. You see, Ptolemy had preserved the cartographic work of Marinus of Tyre, who many years before Ptolemy had developed mathematical and geographical principles that advanced map making, but did very little for terrestrial measurements. But sometime in the 14th and 15th centuries, his estimates became accepted by a rather large portion of explorers and scientists. Ironically, some 300 years before, another deep thinker from Greece, Eratosthenes, had also presented an estimate of the Earth's girth. He felt pretty confident of it. Columbus, believing as many did at the time that Ptolemy had the right idea, was convinced that he could reach the Spice Islands in East Asia by sailing west, thereby eliminating the difficult passage around the tip of Africa and likely shortening the distance sailed. What he and all of Europe didn't know at the time was 2 continents stood in his way. He also was certain that Ptolemy's estimates of the circumference of the Earth were accurate. They decidedly were not. It's interesting that way back in the 3rd century BCE, several hundred years before Ptolemy, Eratosthenes, as we mentioned, had calculated the Earth's actual circumference to within about 1 or 2%. He had the circumference at 25,000 miles. What's the real answer? 24,901 miles. But few thought at the time that this was the accurate dimension. His calculations were abandoned by most. Still, most sailors, navigators, ship owners believed that ships' crews undertaking a voyage west from the European continent to Asia, to India, to the Spice Islands, a necessarily nonstop journey. Remember, they weren't aware of any land masses that stood in their way, but well short of the actual distance, would still die of thirst or starvation before they reached their goal. Consider, if you will, Earth's circumference, 25,000 miles. This would make the distance to Japan and the Spice Islands, Columbus's presumed destination, about 12,200 miles. He thought it would be around 2,500 miles. Here's a fact. No ship in existence at the time of Columbus could have carried provisions for a journey of 12,200 miles. No ship in existence. Well, Columbus had his germinal plan and was determined to find support and sponsorship. Portugal was the world's leader in exploration and discovery. Therefore, this was his target. Columbus presented his idea to Portugal's King John II, first in 1485, again in 1488. John was Henry the Navigator's nephew and strongly supported Portugal's explorations. You may have heard of Prince Henry the Navigator. Henry lived in the late 14th, mid 15th century. He died in 1460. We call him the Navigator. Prince Henry was not a navigator. He never went aboard any of the ships that sailed during the age of exploration and discovery. He did, however, bring together some of the best known cartographers, most respected navigators at his school, we use the term loosely, in Sagres, in Portugal. These are the remains of a chapel in Sagres. None of his buildings remain except this one, and the school was a combination of experts, not an actual school building. He also launched several voyages that discovered a number of islands and landfalls along the west coast of Africa, primarily and notably the Madeiras. But after Bartholomew Dias's success, now you might remember that Dias's course around Africa was the first time that a sailor had rounded the tip of Africa. And the many other exploratory voyages that were bringing Portugal to the brink of world dominance, John wasn't particularly interested in Columbus's project. He had a lot going on already. More to the point, many did not believe that this journey was possible. Well, Columbus could see that there would be no support here. So he left Portugal for Spain, where he would finally, eventually, find the support he sought. Now, we need to go out of timeline chronology to bring in a very important event that enabled this whole story to proceed. We're backing up to around, let's say 1484, 1485, traveling with his son Diego near Palos. He stopped for bread and water at a Franciscan friary, La Rabida. Friaries typically provided food, water, and shelter to travelers. In those times, it was part of their mission. Its guardian, Antonio de Marchena, or Father Juan Perez, or Juan Perez Marchena, again, different sources provide different names. Some divided into two people, some thought there was one, neither here nor there. Marchena admitted him, and as they were dining, Columbus discussed casually his plans for the momentous voyage. He's now focused on France and was bound there to present his plan to the king, Charles VIII. Don't know what you know about France at the time, but he had his hands full trying to defuse a political conflict which became known as the Mad War. This is a story within itself. We're not going to get into it today, but the conflict would have proven an existential danger, a disaster to the traditional monarchy of France, had not the government prevailed. So Charles was not interested in what appeared to be a frivolous idea anyway, and the trip to France would indeed have been wasted. Friar Marchena, an educated man, dedicated cosmographer, gave valuable counsel and advice to Columbus as they discussed his voyage. He also introduced him to a fellow named Martin Pinzon, celebrated seaman who, with his brother, would be of great value to Columbus as captains and masters of some of the ships he sailed. In addition, the friar had access to the power structure at court, great deal of access. Marchena wrote a letter on Columbus's behalf to Bishop Hernando de Talavera, the Queen's confessor at the time. The letter asked the right to petition the royal court, the court that ruled for Spain, the itinerant court, Zenit Cordoba, more than 100 miles away. Big deal. Columbus made his way to the city. Columbus also obtained help from the Duke of Medina Celi, Don Luis de la Cerda, for whom he hired out for some services, and the Duke paid him 3,000 maravedis. You know what a maravedi is? Coin of the realm. It was worth about 1 ounce in gold, and this 3,000 maravedis was about a seaman's salary for a year, or the equivalent. He lived about 2 years at the home of the Duke, and of course made unsuccessful attempts to talk him into helping to sponsor the voyage. He also went to the Duke of Medina Sidonia. Both of these pleas failed. So it was on to the royal court. After submitting his petition, Columbus began a long struggle for approval. This was not an overnight thing. What we learned from our history books in elementary school is in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The story is much longer. There was a great deal of trial and tribulation involved. But now he's beginning his struggle, and he appeals to Isabella and Ferdinand. made presentations at the Royal Council before learned commissions. The government had earlier appointed a commission of ecclesiastics that met at Salamanca in the Dominican convent of San Esteban to investigate the same theme which Columbus had presented to them. Well, the committee reported back to the monarchs that Columbus had miscalculated the distance, and so they rejected the proposal as impractical and advised their bosses to pass on this one. Ferdinand and Isabella turned him down, just as the Portuguese had done, but to keep their options open, they gave him an annual salary and said, stick around. Now, it's hard to imagine Columbus as desperate, but he pursued this mission with the zeal, persistence, and ambition that were so much a part of him. He believed in it. He would plead his case to any possible source of support that led him on numerous treks to many contacts as he could find to obtain his objective. He was definitely a jet setter at that time. Frustration was beginning to set in. And we moved back to 1490 and a longer stay in La Rabida monastery, where he had prominent support for his plan. Support is good, helps your ego, but there wasn't a whole lot of money here. Persistence finally won the day. In 1492, with the war with Granada coming to a successful conclusion, soldiers were out of work and they demanded pay for their services. Pay could come in the form of land. Columbus, after a 4-year effort, had lined up most of his finances. Now remember that the war with the Muslim Emirate over Granada had been decisively won in large part with substantial navy forces provided by King Ferdinand. As a happy coincidence, given the fact that ships might be a good thing for a kingdom to have ready in these days, Isabella had recently penalized the citizens of Palos, quote, for certain acts committed by you to my displeasure. And she demanded at her future request 2 outfitted ships for 1 year. Columbus's plan required 3 ships, 2 down, 1 to go. Juan de la Cosa was the deciding factor. Cosa happened to be in town when the fitting out began. He was a ship owner and a map maker from the northern coast of Spain and was in Palos delivering a shipment, unloading his ship La Galea, the Galician, so named because she was built in Galicia on the northwest coast of Spain. Cosa believed in Columbus and he signed on, chartering and captaining his own ship for the voyage. The other 2 ships, provided by decree by Palos and smaller than Galea, were probably light freighters, the Santa Clara. Santa Clara was known as Nina, after her owner, Juan Nino, and a smaller and brightly painted ship. Don't know what her name was, but they called her Pinto. Why? Because she was brightly painted. Let's pause for a moment and look at the types of ships that took Columbus to sea and provided transport to the thousands of sailors who populated this great era of exploration, discovery, exploitation, conquest. A sailing ship is in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, and indeed until the steamship of the 19th century, the only means of transportation along the surface of about 70% of our world. If we started exploring our water world on a floating log, how did the ship evolve? After all, these are even today the largest moving structures built by man. Well, we won't go into the centuries that produced sail power, the various and sundry strategies of steering a vessel, the many experiments with multiple decks, cargo handling, durability of building materials, and the like. Let's look at a real sailing ship of the 13th century. Where's the rudder? Right, there is no rudder per se. Here's a steering oar. The Egyptians had steering oars back 2000 BC. Is that in advance? A little later, the rudder does show up, but it has its drawbacks early on. How about sails? Is one sail enough? As trade journeys ventured farther and farther from home ports, adding sails on 2, 3, or 4 masts, eventually 7 masts, proved to propel the ships such as the Navas, the Naus, the Dromons, the Cogs, and the hulks of the time at higher speeds, albeit still around 6, 8 miles an hour, and averaging about 4 miles per hour through the course of a voyage. From these early versions of cargo ships and transports grew the caravels and the carracks of the age of exploration. Considered very modern, the hulls simply evolved through trial and error. It'd be a century or so before drawn plans and written building techniques were developed in the shipyards, primarily in Venice. Essentially then, the ship was built for the purpose intended and the nature of the seas in which it would sail. Ergo, the carrack was a most successful design for transporting large cargoes. Typically, a 15th or 16th century carrack would carry up to about 280 to 300 tons. A somewhat smaller 2, 3, or 4-masted ship was the caravel. Typically, a caravel would load up to about 120 to 150 tons. Modifications to these ships were pretty much a universal occurrence as needs arose. So generally speaking, no two would look exactly alike. In fact, we'll see Columbus make changes to 2 of the 3 ships he commanded before he sailed out into the North Atlantic on his first voyage. How well suited were these working ships to the voyages of exploration? Well, the carrack could certainly hold the men and supplies required for the distances and conditions that were anticipated. She was about 110 to 120 feet long. A carrack would draw about 10 to 12 feet. That means from the water line down to the keel would be 10 or 12 feet. There we go. If you're working in 20-foot deep waters, you're fine. If you sail up into 8-foot deep waters, you're not fine anymore. So that was a problem. She was a pretty big ship for her time. The disadvantage was it was difficult to impossible to come in close to shore, impossible to explore rivers and streams and inlets, and she was not a nimble ship. Didn't respond to the rudder with any certainty or speed. So in many cases, you would have to anchor out while the exploration detail rowed to shore and the ship's launch. Those are the smaller boats that ships carried on their decks for just such occasions. So the explorers would be exposing themselves to possible defensive attacks from natives who didn't really want to be bothered by visitors. The caravel, on the other hand, coming in at only 55 to 60 feet, drawing about 5 to 7 feet, could explore inlets and rivers without much fear of running aground. Needless to say, the wind for propulsion would have been somewhat limited in a bay or an inlet, but many caravels had oar ports. Oar ports would allow oars, the help of long oars called sweeps, could move the ship along without any wind. Easy to do on a small ship. You certainly couldn't row a carrack. Another disadvantage, with a crew of 25 to 30 men, we're talking close quarters, 25 to 30 men on a deck 55 to 60 feet long. It was all they could do to keep out of each other's way. By the way, did you know that the hammock at the time was not yet a part of a ship? The sailors slept on whatever square inch of deck they could find. Columbus found the hammock in the islands and brought it to Europe. Now we know that the ships were not the property of Columbus himself, but were loaned by the people of Palos under royal decree, in the case of the caravels, and offered by de la Cosa, owner of La Galea. Columbus would later purchase a share and interest in La Nina and take her on his second voyage. Now the ships are ready. Or were they? Probably Columbus would need a few healthy guys. This would not be a solo trip. He needed caulkers, cooks, sail handlers, secretaries, carpenters, surgeons, interpreters, ship's boys. Fortunately, Queen Isabella's demand as a penalty for the citizens of Palos was for fitted out ships, provisioned and manned. And Friar Marchena, whom we met earlier, was well known and respected in Palos, and therefore was a great help in filling out the remaining crew requirements. By the way, no sane sailor on Earth at the time thought that the ships might sail off the edge. All aboard! On August 3rd, 1492, after loading the food, the water, the supplies needed, Columbus set off from Palos with 3 ships and about 90 crew, 25 each in the Niña and Pinta and 40 in La Galea, now known as St. Mary, Santa Maria, and they worked their way down the Tinto River. As he headed out to sea, Columbus was perhaps the only one who had a clear vision of what lay ahead. He knew his destination and was prepared to demonstrate to any interested party that the distance he would sail would be no more than 2,500 miles. He sailed first down to the Canary Islands. Canary Islands were a routine stop for those ships venturing out into the Atlantic, particularly La Gomera. They would usually proceed from there down the west coast of Africa, not Columbus. But here he reset sails to prepare for the winds of the North Atlantic, converting the Niña from a caravella latina, which was common in the Mediterranean, lateen rigged, to square rigged, caravella redonda, to take advantage of the winds of the North Atlantic Ocean. He also added a topsail to Santa Maria's main mast, took on some fresh peanut butter sandwiches, did some repair and sprucing up, departed to the west to cross the vast Atlantic Ocean, a journey from which many thought he would not return, a journey that would forever reshape the known world. At the ripe old age of 41 now, Columbus was reckoned a little old for this sort of work, but his experience was valuable to him and to his obsession. He was considered one of the finest navigators of his time. He relied mainly on dead reckoning. Dead reckoning requires, I don't think he had one of those. Ah, yes, requires careful measurement of speed and distance. Course is measured with the compass. Speed by throwing a piece of flotsam into the water and estimating by marks on the ship's rail how far the ship proceeds past it within a specific interval of time. This would have evolved into what's called a chip log. Whether there was a chip log in that part of time, we're not sure. It was about the time chip log was coming into being. So if you want to look that up, you'll see what we mean by throwing the flotsam overboard and measuring the time that it took to go 6 feet, 12 feet, whatever it happened to be, along the ship's rail. So he had his tools. He had other navigating tools on board, but he knew to trust his own intuition, his own proven guesswork. He was also able to use the trade winds to his advantage on the way out. You can see how these winds would direct his route. Well, as we know, his trip took not the estimated 21 days, it took 34 days, a third longer than he thought it would. And his seamen were getting restless, afraid, and losing confidence in their captain, in fact, on the verge of mutiny. On the 34th day, the 11th or 12th of October, 1492, a sailor in Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana, spotted land. Imagine yourself on the deck of Santa Maria, Niña, or Pinta on that day. All's well that ends well. All fear is gone. All thoughts of mutiny are gone. They loved Columbus again. Columbus and his crew went ashore in the Bahamas on an island that he named San Salvador. They were met by friendly Indians and exchanged greetings and gifts. Indians, because Columbus believed he had indeed reached the Indies, so the inhabitants certainly must be Indians. This was an exploratory voyage. Columbus had planned to hang around for a time and snoop about to find the gold and spices that he had promised to his royal sponsors. But one of his ships, Pinta, with Captain Martin Alonso Pinzon, remember him, departed their company without permission to look for gold on his own. He was gone for several weeks. Continuing on, Columbus reached Hispaniola. He continued to find friendly people, among them the chief or cacique, whose name was Guacanagari. This cacique was to prove a true ally, as on Christmas Eve in 1492, the Santa Maria ran aground off what is now Haiti. The only way to save the provisions and her 40 sailors was to unload the ship and take everything to shore. The cacique's subjects sent out canoes and ferried the goods to shore and kept watch. Not a single piece of property was lost. The Santa Maria, however, was toast. Now Columbus had a critical decision to make. He must abandon the Santa Maria, but what of the 40 men of her crew? The Pinta was gone with Pinzon at the helm, and Nina could not possibly hold 40 more men. His decision was to break up the Santa Maria and use her stout timbers to build a fort. It will be named La Navidad, Christmas. 40 men will be left behind until Columbus's return. In January of 1493, Columbus left the islands and departed for Spain aboard Nina. His goal to find a westward sea route to East Asia had been somewhat achieved in his own mind. In his report to the monarchs, he mentioned the many islands he claimed in the name of the crown. He mentioned the gentle natives he met, indicated that without any iron weapons, the natives would be easily overcome. They would be Christianized, they would be governed, they would be enslaved. As he sailed with satisfaction out into the Atlantic, he noted a sail on the horizon. He hadn't traveled too far from land, so this could be only one ship. Yep, she was the Pinta, with Pinzon at the controls, chagrined but humble and grateful for the chance reunion with Columbus. The two ships joined courses, and they returned to Spain together. Columbus returned to Ferdinand and Isabella in glory. They were delighted with his success and wanted him to return to the New World as soon as possible. Why? To lay permanent claim to the lands. Columbus's fame spread throughout Europe. He had returned with exotic things Europe had not seen, exotic plants, sculptures, carvings, all sorts of jewelry, and a familiar and welcome item, gold dust. More to the point, he had returned. Not even Ferdinand and Isabella were very confident of that outcome against all odds. His next voyage was a little easier to accomplish. Now, how many of you knew that he made more than one voyage? Fact is, he made 4. There were many others going back and forth during these years also. Chris is the one we're talking about today. Spain now wished to colonize its newfound lands quickly and to establish Christianity among the indigenous people. And so Columbus set sail from Cadiz, Spain in September of 1493 on his second voyage. This one did in fact take just 21 days. But as they landed in the Caribbean, they were met not with the kindness they had experienced among their first landing, but with hostility from the Caribs. The conflict that ensued cost lives on both sides, and Columbus took several Caribs as slaves. He sailed on to return to Hispaniola, only to find that his fort and its settlement had been destroyed. His men, as well as the local natives, had been killed. The 17 ships of this second voyage had brought between 1,200 and 1,400 colonists, and Columbus needed to find a new location for their settlement. He moved about 60 miles eastward, establishing a new settlement called La Isabela. It too proved to be a poorly chosen site and was soon abandoned. Leaving settlers behind, he did some more exploration, finding Cuba, Jamaica, and other islands, then returned to Spain. His third trip to the New World would include the young Bartholomew Las Casas, who would later produce new maps and provide transcripts of Columbus's logs and journals. Those transcripts, written by a very good family friend of the Columbuses, are what we rely on today. The originals, who knows? The small fleet of 6 ships left Spain in May 1496, and after a short visit to Porto Santo, his wife's native land, and Madeira, he made the familiar course for the Canary Islands and Cape Verde to provision his ships for the crossing. On this voyage, his little fleet sailed much farther south than on his earlier crossings. First landing was at Trinidad on July 31st, where he did some exploration and for the first time set foot on American soil. All of his previous landings have been on the shores of islands, but now he has set foot on, until now, one of the unknown continents that stood between him and his lifelong pursuit. Then he sailed off to Venezuela. So Columbus's third voyage brought the first Western Europeans to South America. On to Hispaniola, and more trouble at the colony, either sent by Ferdinand or requested by Columbus. A new governor was put in place. It was Francisco de Bobadilla. Because of accusations of tyranny and poor judgment, Bobadilla had Columbus put in chains and sent back to Spain in disgrace. In May of 1502, with 4 rather old ships under his command, Columbus set out again for the port of Cadiz. With him were his brother Bartholomew and his younger son, Fernando, then just barely 13. Columbus is now 51 and not in the best of health, but he felt that this voyage would give him the praise he had sought and the route west that he'd sought. The focus of this final trip was to find the strait that would link the Indies to the Indian Ocean. Marco Polo had found it, but it was the Strait of Malacca near Singapore, and Columbus was searching for it in Central America. As he arrived at Santo Domingo, there'd been the signs of a hurricane. Well, when Jim Cantori comes to town, there's a sign of a hurricane. You better evacuate. But this is more like what he saw. Requested shelter in the inner harbor. Shelter was denied. He also warned one of the first treasure ships heading out towards Spain to delay their voyage. Columbus was ignored. The treasure ship set sail. Of the 30 ships in the fleet, 20 were sunk in the storm. 9 barely limped back to Santo Domingo. 1 made it to Spain. Ironically, this was the ship that carried Columbus's gold, which had been released to him. All 4 of Columbus's ships lived through the hurricane. Columbus's little expedition sailed into Honduras toward the end of July, spent the next 2 months exploring the coast. Trade was good. He called the land Veragua because for 1 hawk's bell worth a penny, he could end up with $25 worth of gold. Well, his fleet continued east until the gold began to become scarcer, then tried to return to Veragua, but under very stormy conditions, he returned to his exploration headquarters in western Panama, where he built a garrison fort. When the governor finally cleared him for departure, there were no ships available. Fortunately, one of his captains, Diego Mendez, was able to charter a small caravel. Columbus returned to Spain on November 7, 1504, his final voyage complete. Busy and productive 4 voyages. Whether Columbus was the first European to reach the Western Hemisphere may be fuel for debate. Except to set the record straight, it really doesn't matter. It was Columbus who brought Europe to the New World with all the consequences that resulted. Here's a quote: "As a magnifying glass collects sunbeams and focuses them into a white-hot heat, Columbus had collected the best geographic and cartographic knowledge of his time. And with his 4 voyages, he immediately focused the attention of all of Europe on the West, leading countless settlers to find the fame and fortune that had eluded him. While his rewards were sparse and largely disputed, his work was done. No western path to Japan or India, but the Colombian discovery was arguably of greater magnitude than any other discovery in human history. It will not be supplanted until humans populate another planet. Columbus died on the 20th of May, 1506, in Valladolid, Spain. Here endeth the lesson. Enjoyed talking with you. If anyone has questions, we will be happy to answer them, or just make something up.
Great, Ron. Thank you for that. Yeah, please, everybody, go ahead and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A box or raise your hand. While we have people thinking about their questions, I actually had one. So you had mentioned at the end of Columbus's third journey, he was put into, I guess, essentially custody and sent back to Spain. When he got to Spain, like, did the monarchy bail him out, or what happened with him? Do we even know?
The governor had a great deal of control, and he had accused Columbus, because of comments from the settlers, of mistreating the settlers. So he was put in chains. There are stories that he had murdered a number of people. There had been severe consequences for crimes, and he judged those very harshly. But Bobadilla first wanted to take control. So he put Columbus in chains, sent him back. Ferdinand and Isabella had him retained. It was some time before he was released. Once he was released, he was completely pardoned. Incidentally, his brothers were jailed with him, although they had no part in this claim. The claim was delivered by the governor, was supported by the governor, but it was made by the colonists. So we would have to consider that the claim was a legitimate claim against Columbus. He didn't stay in jail for too long, but he was jailed on his return to Spain. Good question.
Great. Okay, so here's a question. What happened to Columbus's son?
His son lived to 1526. He went on at least one and maybe more of Columbus's voyages. Now, because all of the claims that Columbus asked from the crown to be the governor of all the oceans and to get 10% of every settlement that he found and such as that, those claims were largely denied. Most were made on his first voyage. The ones that were granted were destroyed when he was jailed and he became a prisoner with no claims. Diego, who lived till 1526, sometime after Columbus, spent a great deal of his life in the courts of the land claiming the legitimacy of Columbus's claims for the Columbus family that ensued. That's all we know of Diego, that he was his father's apologist and defender.
Okay, great. We had a similar question asking about the legal status, legal claims of his son.
Yes.
So it sounds like you kind of just answered that one.
Never fully treated in any event, yes.
Okay. All right.
Now, there was an inheritance that passed on, in fact, to America. In Boalsburg, Pennsylvania, which is near State College, Pennsylvania, Columbus's family chapel was reconstructed. It was brought over from Genoa by the Bowles family, who are direct descendants of Columbus. The family chapel was brought to Boalsburg, completely restructured stone by stone, and is now a museum. I understand it's closed right now, as unfortunately we all are. But
that's cool. I had no idea about that. I'll check that out.
Boalsburg.
Great. Again, if anybody has any more questions, please let us know. I had another question while other people are thinking of theirs. So the settlement, the fort that they made, La Navidad, did anyone ever like establish what happened? You said that both the Europeans and the natives there were killed. I'm assuming they were invaded by somebody else. Do we know?
over time, I've had to remove slides for this presentation. Some of the Caribs in the area were cannibals. The remnants of the fort, which was apparently burned down, were there. Most of the only bones were found from his 40 men that he had to leave there. The natives in that area would have been very protective to the extent that it was possible to be. But the Caribs were very terrible people. That's probably what happened. That's what most people rely on now.
Great. Yeah, that's really interesting. I had no idea about that part. Okay, we got another question here. Did Columbus have any communications with sailors to India and further east?
There was a great deal of communication going on at the time, but the route to the Indies had not been found well after Columbus's death. That western route had not been found.
Well, I think maybe the question's more like, was Columbus in contact with anyone who had actually been to India and further east?
Oh, well, yes, indeed. The trade goods from India traveled overland. So coming to Venice and Genoa, of course, in Genoa, he would have had contact with traders and people from India to know more about the lands, what they had, and such as that, but nothing at all about any nautical connection. Yes, they were very familiar with the caravans and the people from the trades in India.
Okay, great.
Molucca and the Spice Islands.
All right, well, that looks like about all the questions we have for today.
Very pleased.
Great. Well, thank you, Ron, for everything. And on behalf of everyone else here at the museum, just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you all in the future, and that you'll join us for our other programs. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.